Well, good morning, and I'm excited to be here with David Harrison and Georgia Hurd. They are going to be talking about poetry and using poetry. And the um, David was the creator of the idea of having a special issue for the Missouri Reader. And I'm going to do just a very quick share screen about that. Here we are. Um, so this is the original issue of the Missouri Reader, and we're now coming up on the third issue of the Missouri Reader. So for a number of years now, Missouri Reader has had a special poetry issue, everything you ever wanted to know about how to use poetry. Okay, and that was David's brainchild. So we're going to be using this interview to launch that magazine, but more importantly, we're going to use this interview to pick both your brains, everything we ever wanted to know about how to use poetry, younger and older. So I'll turn things over first to David, who'll do a brief introduction of himself. And then he'll turn that over to Georgia, who will do a brief introduction of herself. And then we get into the question of, okay, for both teachers of younger children and teachers of older children, brainstorm your hearts out about best ways and good ways to do that. And I know that both of you have extensive experience in this. Can't wait to hear what you're going to say. So I'll turn things over first to David. David, take over.
Good morning, Dr. Sam, and thank you so much for setting this up and letting Georgia and me come on and play and talk back and forth. Yes, I did suggest the original poetry issue, but that's the only credit I take. I mean, you and Linda Nugent put it together, and you gave me lots of freedom to invite other people to contribute articles, very wonderful articles to that issue. And so you get the credit, and I get the credit, but you deserve it. And thank you again for that, and for the ongoing interest in poetry. I think Missouri Reader is one of the few journals that I know of that has been a consistent supporter of poetry as a genre, and it's a it's just really a wonderful thing that Missouri is a leader in that area. Um, my my job these days is mostly taking care of being poet laureate of the state of Missouri, a recognition that I never expected, but I did. I was appointed by the governor uh, in 2003. And so my 2-year term expires in June of next year. And so during that period of time, it's been my joy to present a weekly poetry column that is hosted in the Springfield, Missouri News Leader. My editor there is Amos Bridges, who is the editor in chief. And I never intended to write every column myself. I have all these great friends like Georgia Hurd around the country who are experts and wonderfully gifted writers. And so we've had, I think this one coming up will be our 48th consecutive column. And it's featured wonderful poets and proponents of poetry, professors and teachers who don't necessarily write poetry, but who use poetry and have researched with poetry and so on. So I'm producing less than I would like to these days, but it's because I'm happily busy doing other things. And right now I'm working on a poem for the inauguration of the new president of Drury University, because I'm also the poet laureate of Drury. And so I turned to see what who else has written inaugural poems uh, for anybody, for presidents coming in at any level. One of them, of course, that I ran into is Amanda Gorman, who at the time she became the youngest poet laureate, the youngest uh, poet to write and recite a poem at a presidential inauguration of President Biden. And I don't know whether she was still a teenager then. I think she's in her 20s now, but I believe she might have been still a teenager at the time. And I think of another young poet who has written a column for me in this weekly column that I was just mentioning. And her name is Julie Clayton, and she lives in St. Louis area. And Julie was still a teenager. She just had graduated from high school when she became the 2023 champion of the very competitive Poetry Out Loud contest that's held in almost every state in some form or another. And Julie, in that case, they don't write their own poems. They select poetry that they like, and then they learn how to present it. So I'd like to talk more about young people like that as we go forward. But I will say that I think that they're an important link that we need to be aware of, and how they can be role models and influencers for these younger people that are still in high school or middle school as they look for role models in their lives. Young, successful, vibrant poets are a welcome role model to put up there on the stage.
Well, let's turn things over to Georgia, and please have her tell us a little bit about herself. Please take over.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Sam and David. David has been an old friend for many, many years. We've been poetry friends, we've been educator friends, and every NCTE we try to get together and have some kind of tete-a-tete and talk about poetry. And he has really been amazing in terms of keeping the poetry fires burning throughout the United States, and I'm so grateful. I've been a poet since I was a teenager. I didn't know it then. I wrote in my diary and in my notebook, and I didn't really share them because there wasn't a chance to share poetry so much in schools then. And I kept writing. And then I startled my parents when I said, I want to go to poetry school. And they were, what's poetry school? And so after college, I got a Master's of Fine Arts in poetry at Columbia University. And that's when I learned so much about poetry, but I also learned about teaching. I began to work in the New York City schools as a poet in residence, and I was just so inspired by the children that I taught. And I taught from kindergarten all the way up, and I also taught a graduate class at Columbia. And so I've been kind of wearing two hats as a poet as well as a teacher of poetry, and they feed my life both. And I feel like as a poet, sometimes poetry, it's you can sit at your desk and you can write poems and you can feel very individual, kind of alone. But when you get out in the world and start teaching, start talking to people about poetry, starting to listen to what kids have to say and what teachers have to say, it's so inspiring. So I have a new book on teaching poetry. It's a second edition of an older book that was published about 20 years ago. It's called Awakening the Heart, Teaching Poetry from Kindergarten through 8th grade. And it has a lot of my work that I've done in the last, couple of decades, new work on teaching poetry, new thoughts. And then I have also a couple of new children's books, poetry books. One is Welcome to the Wonder House, co-written with Rebecca K. Dotlich. And the other newest one, I think, is My Thoughts Are Clouds, Poems for Mindfulness, which I wrote and came out right after COVID. And I've found that poetry is one of those forms that it can be part of the curriculum, the emotional curriculum of a classroom, because it helps honor children's feelings. So that's a little bit about myself. Oh, I also got recently, I guess 2023, the NCTE Award for Excellence in Poetry for Children, which is honoring an American poet for their aggregate work for children ages 3 through 13. And that was very unexpected. And I'm very, very honored.
And very, very well earned and deserved.
Thank
Okay,
you.
well, I am so honored to have two people with such a depth of background in the whole issue of poetry and teaching poetry. And now I'd just like to have a free-for-all of ideas because you both have so many. Well, I'll put my 2 cents worth in, which is over the years, and my major thing has always been teaching reading, that of all the different possible things that you could use in a classroom, that poems are so meaning rich. Lots of bang for the buck. Not a lot of, you don't need a lot of time, but incredibly meaningful. So from a teaching standpoint, it's kind of like, oh my gosh, that's the kind of thing that you can use with kids very effectively. And now, okay, I'm just going to leave this as a wide open thing. Start chiming in, folks, about ideas for both teachers of the younger children, teachers of the older children, things that you found in New York that were highly successful. I know David was talking about some recent presentations he's done on the topic. So, how about giving my listeners out there a potpourri of things, of ideas that would help them use poetry to teach? It's all open. Take somebody grab it.
My turn again?
Show there are no turns here. The key word there was free for all. This is
Well,
tell us what you know.
I just did a book with Tim Rosinski and Lynn Kulich, based on Tim Rosinski's original fluency plan. And he developed this fluency development plan on one sheet of paper, just like a list of 10 things to do 20 years ago. And it's for those teachers who are working with beginning readers, kids who are learning a second language, struggling with words and language. And so Lynn, who was also a classroom teacher, took that idea when she was in graduate school and developed it into a regular full-time 5-day-a-week program. So the two of them got together. They're both brilliant people, and decided to do a book. So this started with one piece of paper, and we turned it into a 456-page book, and we could only use 80% of it. It was going to be a 600-page book, and the editor said, "Oh, my job as the poet was to write the poetry." And so as I often do when working with professors or teachers who they know their field and much better than I do, but I can do what I do, and that's to provide the material that they then use to go forward. And so we talked a lot about how these very young beginning readers take the sounds of the words and learn how to manipulate them and all the phonics and the fluency is such a big thing, and fluency isn't taught as much maybe or emphasized quite as much as comprehension and vocabulary developing and understanding and cadence and all that. But fluency is kind of the whole picture. It's how we read, it's how we perceive, it's how we get through a sentence or a paragraph and understand it and make sense of it all. So I didn't need to be convinced, but I certainly was reinforced how important poetry is in helping young people develop their reading skills at whatever level. And I think that maybe Georgia can speak to this too, but I think that continues even after kids are up and running. It's like we've taken the training wheels off the bicycle. The kids are reading on their own, but how do we keep that love of poetry alive, because it continues to support and it continues to be not only just fun to read, but it's still doing a job. And Rosinski is a big one on practice, 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 rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. The more times you read something, the better you're going to get at it. Like anything else, the more you practice. So poetry is short as a rule. Much of it rhymes. Many poems written with young people in mind are humorous, not necessarily, but they have a good picture, good images, easy to memorize, easy to remember, easy to project when you read. So I think that goes on up through all the ages, and I hope we'll get to some of that older age as we go. But I think, and I'll leave on this thought, that one of the things that poetry does that we don't mention often enough is that it helps kids learn how to speak to other people in front of an audience. And I have some examples. I'd like to talk about that if we have time. Georgia.
Yeah. I love what you say, David. I love your book, that, your content poems. I think it makes so much sense to try to include that poetry across the curriculum. And I guess for me, especially if we speak about older students, so usually the way poetry is taught is teachers give a poem to the whole class, and then they ask a series of questions, and it's usually written. I remember stopping by woods in a snowy evening. I was in a classroom, I think it was a middle school, and the teacher had given the Robert Frost poem, Stopping by Woods in a Snowy Evening. And there were about 10 questions about the poem that the kids were supposed to provide written answers for. And I thought about that, and I thought, if I were just approaching poetry and I had a series of questions I had to answer, I don't think I would ever turn to poetry again. So one of the things that I talk a lot about with older students and with teachers who teach older students is to not turn it into kind of an analysis or a quiz, because that does not promote a love of poetry. Instead, I think a lot of immersion is important in the beginning. Just reading a poem a day, if you can, even a poem a week, living with one poem for several days and coming in and just reading a poem and having children and students respond to that either orally or in their notebooks. And I usually suggest, if you're going to ask a question, ask open questions. And the 3 questions that I usually suggest, one is, what do you understand about this poem? What do you notice about this poem? And sometimes those can, be the same question and answer. And then the last thing is, what does this poem make you feel? And every student will approach the poem in a different way, but there's an openness about that. What do you understand? And what do you notice? And a lot of times kids will notice the craft. They'll notice the rhyme. They'll notice, oh my goodness, there's these things called line breaks or stanzas. And then we can, as educators, we can come in and begin to define what poetry is through those kind of open questions. So I have a lot to say about this, but we're gonna play tennis here, or pickleball, I guess is the new, which I've never done, but poetry pickleball. So, David.
I, I, I was smiling when you were talking about that teacher requiring analysis. You're familiar probably with Billy Collins' poem about that, where he invites his students to enjoy the poem, but they insist on tying it to a chair and beating it with a rubber hose until it confesses what it really means. And that's so often the case, and with a predictable result, as you suggest. Sorry, one of my favorite activities is involving partner poems. Many reasons for that, but one is because it enforces reading. When your partner is speaking, you have to be reading what he or she is saying so you'll know when it's your turn again. And two, it develops that sense of trust between two readers, how you can play off one another, and the total of those two readers is almost always more than you expect. But also, I was in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia many years ago, speaking at an international school. And during the course of the week, one day I had them writing partner poems and then reciting to the class. Well, one of the girls was just so shy she could hardly stand it. I mean, it just hurt her to be in public. The other one was just a typical show-off kid. You couldn't keep her down. She just kept up speaking up and all that. So I put the two together I think it was the shy one who'd written a poem, sent them to the back of the room for 5 minutes to practice. And they came back and something magic happened. The kid who was so shy suddenly blossomed and lost her timidity and spoke out with confidence because her partner was. And one was a positive tonic to the other. So I learned something valuable that day is that, and I don't know that it works every time or with every child, but it happened that time. So it could happen again.
That's wonderful. Yeah. And just playing off that, the whole idea of poems for two voices, especially for younger students, I think that, and I mean, David, you've written many of those. And I think even in one of my anthologies, you have a poem for multiple voices, right? And
the chorus of the frogs.
Yeah, the frogs, yeah. And I actually have a book called Boom, Bellow, Bleat, Animal Poems for Two or More Voices. And this is all animal sounds, the sounds that animals make. For instance, there is a frog poem in here, and people who read it, you can read it as a group, you can read it multiple voices, and it's kind of the difference between what a frog says and a toad says, and they say all kinds of things like quonk and wah, not just the poem is called We Don't Say Ribbit. And what I have found is for younger kids especially is that poems for two voices, especially if you bring in puppets, which I usually do, if you can find frog puppets are pretty easy to find. It's a way for them to, it's a reader's theater naturally built into these poems. And some of them are more sophisticated. There's a cricket poem that talks about the whole idea that you can count, if you count the number of chirps of crickets within, I think it's 30 seconds, you can then you can discover the temperature outside. So it's called cricket arithmetic. So there's lots of ways that, just like David does with his content area poems, you can build in, there's a lot of nonfiction poetry. You can build in facts, but you can also have fun. You can turn poetry into kind of a reader's theater. A long time ago, before I wrote this book, a lot of my students, we would talk about choral reading, and we would turn a poem into multiple voices, even if it weren't written as multiple voices. And I do believe that's a way to read, to really read closely, to try to figure out what are the different voices, what are the different sounds, is there a natural refrain in this poem? So I do think that that kind of poetry is very, very playful. And you can, when kids are with their partners, they can even write their own two-voiced or multiple voice poems and have the class perform them or even perform them themselves. So that's just piggybacking on your idea, David. So.
Okay. I think we're getting close to the point where we could go on for hours, but we can't. uh, and I want to give you both a chance to kind of all the points you wish you'd said, is there anything left that you're really, boy, I better get this in, or Sam didn't give me a chance to get that in, and man, I'm going to tell him about that. So I want to hear about what you might think is your most important idea. But gosh, you've already had a ton of great important ideas. And then I want us to remember one last time who our audience here is, and that audience are teachers who are in the classroom every day. What you just said about this bringing joy back to reading, that's one of my favorite topics. And I really think it does. And there's a need for that and bringing joy. And the idea of reading to perform and all the wonderful work Brzezinski and his friends are doing around that. And I'll make sure to have a link to the uh, uh, different uh, stories that can be done in multiple voices. And of course, I'll include links to some of the things that you guys have talked about. But the key thing here is last chance. And I guess let's have Georgia go first and then David. Of something that's still in your heart that you got to say before we wrap this up. So I'll start with you.
Yikes. No pressure. Okay.
Right. I
So
warned you about that.
yeah, I guess I have to say that poetry is the gateway to literacy. And both David and I, and Sam, you've probably discovered this as well. Because one of the very basic reasons is it's short, it's manageable, but it's also, as you say, it's meaning rich. So that gateway, so many students I've taught, for many, many years, and those students who feel like writing is a challenge, reading might be a challenge, poetry is their doorway into literacy. They fall in love with it. So it's not just for those kids who find reading and writing challenging. It's really for every child. And I think that if we just make an invitation by reading poetry out loud, we don't have to know everything there is about poetry, but just make that invitation by introducing poetry, reading it very frequently from the first day of school. I believe that kids will just take to it naturally and begin to write, even have paper there so that the children begin to write. But I think it's such an important form. It's not even a form. It's really kind of an experience. And I have a lot more to say, but I better cut it short. But that's probably my one big belief about teaching poetry.
Okay, and David, before I turn it back over to you, I have to really think about sponge activities. How do you work doing that in on a daily basis? Well, gosh, if you're in line for lunch and class cuts ahead of you, if you've got a little something to read to them, it's a perfect sponge. There are so many little opportunities during the day that teachers can take advantage of if they just think about it. And once it becomes a norm, I found it was a lifesaver, especially when this teacher cut in front of my lunchtime. Okay, so anyway,
And it
bringing back old memories.
and it really only takes a minute to read a poem. So you can start every class and every day, and it really doesn't cut into your day. It just takes a minute for most poems. So,
Okay, David, your final thoughts.
People ask writers how they find the time to write. And we say, well, we just find it whenever we can. And teachers can do the same thing. They don't want to be told that, I know, because they're so horribly busy. But it doesn't take long, and the benefits are great. My last thought, I think, was I want to harp a little bit more, but on the advantage of that poetry gives us in teaching kids or giving kids more confidence on their feet. But speaking well in front of others is a lifelong gift. In the workplace, it may be the difference between leading and following. It may be the difference between promotion and not promotion. Those who speak well, who are articulate, have an advantage. And poetry is a great tool to help kids learn how to speak in front of others. And I was teaching a camp for teenagers one summer, and there's this one 13-year-old girl who wrote a great poem but couldn't get it out. And I read it for her after she had tried, and then the kids in the audience just weren't hearing it. And so I read it aloud for her, and they were crying. It was a sad poem, and they should have cried, but they did, and she did too. It's just such an incredible gift when we can help kids become comfortable on their feet in front of others, and that's something that poetry can also do for us.
Well, I really want to thank the two of you. Maybe we'll have to do this again in a webinar form or something because I know there's more to cover, but we've got to stay within that magic timer. And I think we've done that. So I really want to thank both of you for taking the time out to do this. I especially want to thank both of you for the many, 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 many gifts you've given both teachers and students in the way of all your works. Now, there's one final thing. It's a silly, George might not know about this. It's a silly thing that comes at the end of a Bomarito interview, and that is we put big smiles on and give the audience a Zoom wave goodbye. So let's get those hands up and thank you so much. This was delightful.
thank you so much.